Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today, it is the final episode of the year. What a year 2022 has been. Goodbye 2022. Hope I never see you again. And unless you invent time travel, I won't. And I thought, what better way to wrap up 2022 than to talk about my top 15 trashy books I read in 2022. Now, I was going to do a top 10, but then I was like, there's too much trash to celebrate. If you don't know me, and this is your first time here, just know I absolutely adore trash. For me, I don't think trash is a negative thing by any means. The way that I'm going to qualify trash in here is mainly due to they're kind of like books that are just doing one thing really well, or they're not trying to do anything in depth or trying to change the world. They're just trying to tell a very concise story in a certain set of parameters. So it's either that, so think like animal attack books, stuff like that, where it's just like, hey, this is just about an animal attacking people, right? Like it's nothing deeper than that. Or in some of these cases, books that I think are actually not super well made, but have a lot of really interesting elements in them. So I don't, for me, trash is not like a derogative in any type of word, but it's just, it's what we're using today to kind of celebrate books that are not going to be making any list on the New Yorker. Let's just say that. So let's just start. Number 15. You know it. You love it. You probably not either, by the way. I'm pretty sure only one other person who's watching this has even read one of these books. But this is Lone Star and the Border Bandits. This is actually Lone Star number 3. This is the first Lone Star book I read, and so far it's the only Lone Star book I've read. But it is something that I have become obsessed with and am slowly collecting the rest of the series. So it is a book that just kind of I bought because it was in the 25-cent bin at my local used bookstore. Well, this is new. It was Nami that was interrupting us today, not Loomis. So now I have Lami. Lami? I don't know who Lami is, but I have Nami on my shoulder because now she was interrupting the video, and that's okay. So sorry, as I was talking about, Lone Star and the Border Bandits is something I found at my used bookstore for 25 cents and was like, what the heck? And it's ended up being really, really adorable and really, really interesting as it pretty much kind of breaks the normal barriers of the Western genre, because the Western genre is a whole bunch of like, boy, howdy do I love shooting guns. Shooting guns is the best. Kabang, kabang, kabam. And look, I'm not immune to a good action shoot 'em up when I read them, but they're not my first choice as I get into fiction. And Lone Star, it kind of breaks the rules because one of the main characters is a ninja, essentially. Like he's a Japanese martial artist, and this is written, I believe it's like early 80s ish. There's some iffy parts in the way that it describes Kai, but I do think in general, it is probably pretty fun to still read now. But he is one of the main characters, and he pretty much throws shurikens at racists or like just martial arts against like people, and it is very antithetical to the normal vibe of the Western genre, and I really did kind of like that switch up. And he's also teamed up with Jessie Starbuck, who is a rootin' tootin' old-fashioned female gunslinger from the Western trope. So you do get everything in a Lone Star book. You get things that go against the trends and things that are just exactly what you think about when you pick up a Western. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. Also very, very smutty. So much smut in this. You can probably skip the smut, really, if you're not a person who likes that, and then you only read like 50 pages, I think, because there's a lot of it. But yeah, I loved Lone Star and the Border Bandits, and I can't wait for next year to kind of get into more Lone Star books. Number 14, Carnivore by Lee Clark. What is Carnivore? It is a book about a T-Rex that awakens in the Arctic. And my favorite thing about this is if you go on Goodreads, there are people who are like, I just couldn't suspend my disbelief. And I'm like, yeah, dudes, they found a dinosaur egg in the Arctic and then they just threw a bunch of radiation on it. Yeah, it's not realistic. Why would you go into this book being like, I hope I get a scientific examination of how the Tyrannosaurus Rex would do in the winter? And it's like, no, bitch. We're here to watch a dinosaur eat people. And let me tell you, the dinosaur eats a lot of people, and it's glorious. It's just an irradiated dinosaur just eating people in the Arctic. I absolutely had a great time with this. All the characters are super cookie cutter. There's no depth in terms of what kind of characters we have. There's no one really cared about believability when they wrote this book. And honestly, all the better for it. This is just a book about a T-Rex killing a bunch of people in the Arctic, and I loved it. Or it might have been the Antarctic. Don't get in my comments. The only other person who's read this book is Joshua from Copycats and King. I don't know. I just brain down like he's a patron saint. Oh, yes, Joshua from Copycats and King, the patron saint. Yeah, so I really did like that. A really, really fun book. Next up, number 13, lucky number 13. This is A Werewolf in Riverdale. And I don't know if I've talked about this at all. This is one of the first books in the Archie horror line. So Archie Comics did a whole bunch of comic books that were like horror based, starting with The Afterlife with Archie, which is like a zombie tale. Then there's Jughead the Hunger, which is Jughead as a werewolf, and a whole bunch of stuff in that vein. And this is a book that is kind of an adaptation of that comic series, but not really. Like, it kind of does its own thing. But there is elements that if you've read Jughead the Hunger comic book, you might be like picking up little bits and pieces here. But most of all, it's just a really good werewolf story. And it's really cool because Archie as a character, they are already characters you know and love. They've got all of the archetypes of a horror story or horror book. But there's that extra level to it in that you already have investment in these characters if you do like Archie at all. So it's one of those things where you don't need to introduce a lot of these characters, because if you're picking up a Riverdale book, you pretty much know all these characters. They are pretty much what they seem at the top of it. So you don't really have a lot of fluff in this. It's all just action. And the horror bits are actually really written pretty well in this. There's some really scary, spooky scenes in this. And I was really surprised. Like, I think this is a really solid werewolf book. I've never heard anyone talk about it. It's a book that I had in my Audible collection that was just sitting there for ages, and I just finally picked it up and listened to it. So I'm really glad I did. I actually like it better than the comic book series Jughead the Hunger, which I just think is a bit too... I don't like the artwork in Jughead the Hunger. I think it just goes a little bit too far where it's not as enjoyable. But this is a really good... mid-level to that, and just a really good horror tale with the Archie characters. And there is at least one more book in this vein, and I will definitely pick that one up in the future, because I really like this. It's just a really solid horror tale, written really well, and a lot of very interesting, compelling scenarios to put this very famous old school cast into. So 100%, I would definitely recommend that one. Next up, one that I just recently read this month, and that is The Umbrella Conspiracy, which is by S.D. Perry, and this is the novelization of the very first Resident Evil game. I was really impressed by this because it manages to capture the video game super well, but also write it in a way that if you haven't played the video game, you'd still be able to get all of the core elements that make the video game what it is, and also be told in a very compelling, interesting way. If you've ever played the original Resident Evil, especially at this time, because this was before the remakes had come out, the original Resident Evil video game has like very hammy dialogue, and it's very fun, but it's very much like it was a game made in Japan that was utilizing localization from just other English speakers that they had available in Japan. So like it's not like super fluid, and it's not as intricate as it would be in, say, a normal video game. And I think it's really cool. A book like this is that you get these characters in these scenarios that you have either played yourself or you have a general knowledge of, but they feel like real characters now because S.D. Perry kind of gets in their head and expands these characters in some really, really interesting and unique ways that kind of make them compelling to read. And I had a really great time with this. I've never actually fully beat or fully played through the original Resident Evil. I've only kind of done bits and pieces here or there. So I was really impressed to see how they managed to flesh out that story in a novel format. And they don't lose things like puzzles because, you know, in that original Resident Evil, there's a whole bunch of puzzles you have to solve, and there's a whole bunch of things you have to solve to like get through the next step of the game. And S.D. Perry even manages to incorporate puzzles, and she does it in a really interesting, really smart way, to which it almost feels like you're kind of, at some points, you're reading like an escape room scenario, essentially. And I don't know, I was really kind of impressed with it. I thought it was really well written in the sense of that it flows really well. I was instantly invested in some of these characters, and I just had a great time with it. And yeah, I was really, really impressed with it. So I would definitely recommend this if you're at all even remotely into zombies. I imagine if you're into zombies or horror, anything, you probably would enjoy this book because there's a pretty fun and well construed book. Next up, this is Something Out There by Ronald Kelly. Now, this is a fascinating book in that Ronald Kelly is an author who I think really, really does well at starting stories. I consistently love the ways that he opens up a tale, and I find myself like invested in these characters. He really fleshes out characters like super well in the beginnings, and then we kind of hit a wall where he is so good with his characters that it seems like in later parts of the book he just can't kill them. Like you know, Stephen King will create a really good character, but when that character has like stopped being super useful to the plot, they either go away or they get killed or something happens, and it kind of like narrows our focus on a specific set of characters. And Ronald Kelly is a person who I think has a lot of writing talent and writes very interesting tales, but he can't whittle down his cast so that there's usually too many people survive, and then the horror elements kind of suffer because of that, in that you don't feel like anything could happen and we're all really in danger. As such, when we get to the second half of his books, it's fun to read and exciting and, you know, adventurous and well written and elements, but you don't have a strong sense of horror for it. It kind of takes up this really good setting and then kind of gets to that point where it's like, okay, this is not the greatest book of all time, which is how it kind of starts. And Something Out There is a perfect example of that, is that it really has this super compelling first half, and then it becomes an animal attack books for the second half. And the creature he makes is like super interesting, but it's kind of invincible for a large portion of it. So like you don't feel a lot of, you know, when there is these villains who are set up who are like these army veterans who are like set up to take out this creature at the end of the book, but they don't have any effectiveness against this creature because it's just all powerful, and it just seems like it's invincible till the very end when something has to be done about it. And yeah, it's interesting. I would still recommend it. It's a very fun read. I would say it's one of those rare horror books where the monster is actually the good guy. So the main creature is actually kind of the hero of the tale in a very interesting way. There are a few dated elements. I think that when he introduces our commandos, let's just say, some of them are from different parts of the world, and Ronald Kelly does not write all of them super duper well, unfortunately. But other than that, I would still say that Something Out There is a great book. It's just one of those things where it just kind of suffers in that you don't feel the horror throughout, and the characters are good, but at that end point, he likes them so much and he's not going to kill them, so they have to be far outside of the main action. So that is just a little thing about that. Now we are finally into our top 10. Top 10, number 10. I just read this book a few days ago, and this is Brutal Canon. And if you don't know anything about Warhammer 40k, this is a Warhammer 40k book. What is Warhammer 40k? Warhammer 40k started out as a tabletop game where people would paint little miniatures and set them into battle. And it kind of has expanded into books and everything like that, and video games, and this whole complicated world. I never actually played the game. I have never actually read any of the books until this month, where at the end of this month, I read a lot of them. And one of the ones that I think is just so much fun is that this book in particular is something that I think you could probably pick up and enjoy without having any prior experience with this world. The bare bones of it all is that humans are not really great in this universe, and they're led by this horrible man called the Emperor of Man, who at this point, he is just this undead corpse on a throne, who is pretty much ruling all of humanity, and humanity is basically just a bunch of evil fascists at this point, destroying things and being completely awful, and all of the universe is like constantly at war. And this makes it really interesting because this book in particular is about the orcs. Now, in almost every other fantasy universe, the orcs are like the biggest villains. They like the evil servants of evil, the most evil things of all time. And as a case, they just kind of suck in most fantasy. Like, I'm not a fan of orcs in a fantasy setting most of the time because they're not really well fleshed out. They're not really well interesting at all. Like, you know, I don't mind the Tolkien books, obviously. Like, Lord of the Rings is a classic, but those orcs are just there. Like, they're just fodder. They don't do much. They're not that interesting. So it's really funny because in a world like this, where everyone is kind of a villain and there's like this very dark universe, orcs are still, like, they're not great. They're basically like warmongering people who do like horrible things, right? Because they're just constantly at war and constantly in battle. But for whatever reason in this universe, they're all Cockneys. They all have Cockney accents. They all talk in like very like British Cockney slang, and they are just like constantly like just looking to have fun and getting into scraps. Like they don't have any like, you know, they don't think about like war and all these things to like gain anything. They just want to go and get into a fight and have a good scrap and blow some stuff up. So there's like this purity to them in that they just want to do war and have fun and like get drunk. And it's so funny because these orcs are going to try to take over and attack this planet of like super high depth, super high tech evil Mars priests who are basically like, they're called the Adeptus Mechanicus, but like they're basically like a whole culture of cyborgs who like worship machines and are like a super like, it is not logical to do this. And then it's like, it's switching from their perspective, which are like, the orcs are coming, blah, 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 to like the orcs perspective, we're like, oh yeah, let's just blow this kid up. Yeah. It's so fun. Like, it's so fun and it's so wild. It's like literally like, it's like a war between the space snobs versus the space slobs, and it's so much fun. And I think what's really captivating about this is that the writing for the action is also done really well. So this is a very funny scenario already, but the actual action set pieces are like really compelling, and there's all these like ins and outs going on with the Adeptus Mechanicus side, where there are like people who are like plotting against them, trying to take them down from the inside, and they're just being like thwarted at every turn because the orcs are just doing whatever they want. Like, the orcs are like not into some like larger evil plan. They just want to fight, so they're just having a blast, like blowing things up and like flying around. And there's like this like very in-depth like of like human human v human interaction happening in between that. And I just thought it was glorious. It was very funny, very exciting, very well written, but it is just like a giant fight between slobs and snobs. But like in this intergalactic scale, it is so much fun. I would super duper recommend Blue Cunning. Number 9, Planet X. This is an X-Man and Star Trek The Next Generation crossover novel that is actually a sequel to the time that they met in like comic books, because there was like a comic book version. I never read that comic book original meeting between them. I don't think you need to read this book at all. I had a great time with this. Like, this was so much fun because it's one of those ideas that like you shouldn't work. There's too many, like, there's a team like Star Trek. There's so many people in Star Trek Next Generation, and there are so many X-Men, and the idea of combining these two properties, it's like no one's going to be happy with any of this. Like, how are you going to do this? And it happens. Like, they do it. Michael Jan Friedman does it. Like, he manages to take this exuberant, ridiculous concept and tell a very fun and compelling adventure story. Because essentially, like, the X-Men get brought into the Star Trek universe, and they, along with the TNG crew, have to go onto this planet to solve a crisis that's happening because one of the planets in the Federation has had a scenario where they've started to get mutants. So there is basically like a X-Men Star Trek planet that is happening, so that the X-Men and the Star Trek characters have to go and solve it in a way. And that setup for that planet is super interesting and really well told and very exciting and very fun to read. And then it will cut back to elements of just the X-Men interacting with various members of the TNG crew, and like, you know, you get Worf and Wolverine like teaming up fighting things in the holodeck, and like it's just little things like that. There is a point where this is written before that first X-Men movie, so you have a scene where Picard talks to it's not Professor Xavier, but it's like it's a version of Professor Xavier in the holodeck. It's Star Trek stuff happens. But anyways, and there's a bunch of jokes about how much Picard and Professor X look alike. And that's written before the movie, in which Patrick Stewart, who played Picard in The Next Generation, would become Charles Xavier in the X-Men's, those early X-Men movies. And this is written before that happened, so it is making a joke about that, and it's basically just, you know, Picard, like, Patrick Stewart meeting Patrick Stewart. And it's little things like that just really make it an extremely fun book to read. This is written with, for X-Men, this is Storm is in charge of the team. I always think that's like the best version of X-Men, when you have Storm in a leadership position. So that adds to a whole bunch of fun stuff. And yeah, it's silly. Like, it's inherently a silly concept, but I think that it works super well and is so much fun that if you even passingly like both of these franchises, I would say pick this up, because yeah, this is just a fun, relaxing, ridiculous read.